My name is Jeff Wiltsey. I'm a professor in the history department, and on behalf of the University of Montana History Department, I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's talk. It's gratifying to look out and see so many people who I assume are from the community. Sometimes you look out and there's lots of students who've been bribed to come with extra credit. It's gratifying to look out and see so many people who have come without bribery. And I think you'll be well rewarded for coming tonight with the talk. I want to thank a couple of people and point out a couple of organizations that have co-sponsored this event with the history department. This is the Hampton Lecture. This is the 9th time that the history department has brought a scholarly expert or a writer to campus to give a public talk. And the topics are in the history of the U.S. West, in public history, or someone who has expertise in a topic of public interest. And tonight's speaker, I think, checks all three of those boxes. And there's definitely public history involved with the Nez Perce Trail. This is definitely a topic about the history of the U.S. West. And I think it's a topic that has public interest, which is sort of testified by how many of you have come here tonight. The whole lecture series, and it's not a series in the sense of many lectures each year, but one a year, an annual lecture, it's been made possible by the generosity of Alan and Susan Newell, who have been here every year with us and are here again. And I would sincerely like to say thank you to Alan and Susan. When we started this 10 years or 9 years ago, the state seemed rich with natural resource money. The university seemed to be relatively rich with resources. Things have changed. And right now we're in a period of shrinking budgets and diminishing resources, which makes us all the more reliant as a university and as a community on private money. And so I think in times like this, we should be especially appreciative of those who are willing to give to promote a vibrant intellectual life both on campus and within the Missoula community. So thank you very, very much. This is named the Hampton Lecture, and it's in honor of H. Dwayne Hampton, commonly and popularly and affectionately known as Hamp, who was an emeritus member of the history faculty. Hamp, how long did you teach in the history department?
Much longer than I can remember. Actually, I could barely remember having taught.
Not sure what to say about that. So Alan was a student of Hamp's, and perhaps not surprisingly, had a great experience, such a good experience that he's been willing to name. He has been willing to name this lecture series after Hamp. And so a small testimony to how impactful good teaching can be and the rewards that might come from it in later. I'd like to introduce Pat O'Connor, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Pat is a PhD candidate in the Department of History, and so please welcome him to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Jeff. As Jeff said, my name is Pat O'Connor. I'm a doctoral candidate in the History Department here at UM. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce Daniel Sharfstein, Professor of Law and History and Tarkington Chair in Teaching Excellence at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. Professor Sharfstein received his JD from Yale in 2000 and since has published widely. His work has appeared in scholarly journals including the Yale Law Review and Common Knowledge, as well as popular publications such as Slate, The Washington Post, and The American Prospect. In 2011, he published The Invisible Line, 3 American Families and the Secret Journey from Black to White, a book that the New York Times called an astonishingly detailed rendering of the variety and complexity of racial experience in an evolving national culture, moving from slavery to segregation to civil rights. The Invisible Line received significant praise inside the Academy and beyond, and eventually won the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize from Columbia Journalism School and the American Society for Legal History's William Nelson Cromwell Book Prize. Earlier this year, Professor Sharfstein published his second book, Thunder in the Mountains, Chief Joseph, Oliver Otis Howard, and the Nez Perce War. Thunder in the Mountains is not only a gripping account of the Nez Perce War and the lives of its participants, although it's absolutely that. It's also a momentous contribution to the scholarship of the world the Civil War and Reconstruction made. As few scholars have or could, Sharfstein has illuminated the era's most pressing problems. And I think those are problems that have immense relevance in 2017. This book forces us to reconsider the meaning of freedom in a democratic polity and the processes by which that meaning was constantly formed and reformed in the decades after the Civil War. It exposes the breathtaking extent of federal power in the 19th century, but also asks readers to consider the limits of that power. It details the surprisingly fluid nature of the nation's social, cultural, and political boundaries, as well as the tragic processes by which those boundaries were hardened as the 20th century approached. And maybe most importantly, Thunder in the Mountains celebrates the power of dissent, even when that dissent comes from society's margins and is directed at a seemingly boundless imperial state. I would love to go on and on about this book, but I can't. That's not why you're here. So I'll just say you really should pick up a copy of it. It's available, in fact, in fiction and on Amazon. I guarantee you will not regret it. Professor Sharfstein is going to talk for about 40 minutes about the book, and then we'll have time for questions after. So please join me in welcoming Daniel Sharfstein.
So I have about 3 microphones here, just wrapped in wires. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Great. So I thank you, Pat, for such a lovely introduction, and I'm very grateful to Jeff Wiltse and Professor Kyle Volk for organizing the lecture, and to Alan and Susan Newell and Camp Hampton for making this lecture series possible and for inspiring so many University of Montana students to study the American West. It is wonderful and really special for me to be in Missoula today, October 5th, the 140th anniversary of the end of the Nez Perce War. It's wonderful to be so close to the Nez Perce Trail, to be in sight of the Bitterroot Mountains, to be in the land of the Bitterroot Salish, the Kootenai, Pend d'Oreille, Blackfeet, Shoshone. I love these crisp fall days, the scent of pine and the bright, clear light. It must be a big relief after the fires of this summer. So 140 years ago, in the summer of 1877, people in Missoula were watching the horizons, and they found themselves waiting for dark clouds of smoke to rise. A few hundred Nez Perce families had crossed the Lolo Pass. Settlers from Missoula and the Bitterroot Valley had tried to set up a barricade, but what wound up being called Fort Fizzle didn't stop Nez Perce leaders like Looking Glass and Whitebird, Tohuhuzo, Joseph, Ollicott. Didn't stop the women who carried rolls of greenbacks ready to buy supplies in Stevensville. It didn't stop the children who, for decades to come, would remember their journeys from Idaho into Montana. So I want to begin tonight by reflecting on how their struggle, the struggles of 1877, remain our struggles today. So the decades after the Civil War and Reconstruction are a crucial moment for America. It's when the foundation was laid for battles that we're still fighting, that we just keep fighting over the contours of liberty and equality, over the relationship between race and citizenship, and over the proper size, scope, and role of government. So let's think about it. In 1865, the United States, at least east of the Mississippi, was a beacon of liberty and equality to the world. It had fought a war to abolish slavery, and the government was devoting itself to turning millions of people who had been held as slaves into citizens. Congress had created a new agency, the Freedmen's Bureau, to redistribute confiscated rebel land and help free people get paying jobs. The Bureau built schools, hospitals, orphanages, asylums, court systems. This was the first big federal social welfare agency in American history. Now, this is a cartoon typical of the time. It's captioned Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner. The peoples of the world are gathered around the table, and Uncle Sam is there slicing up the turkey. Everyone gets a piece. But by 1900, America was following a very different course. Instead of working to integrate all people into the body politic, instead of seating everyone around the table, the entire purpose of government had shifted. All that policymaking energy that had been devoted to making our nation free and equal had been redirected to a project of sifting and sorting. Segregation and disenfranchisement, Jim Crow, was the rule of the South, and really the rule of just about everywhere else in the US. And every 2 or 3 days in the South, an African American was lynched. 1900, Chinese immigrants were banned from the US, and places like Ellis Island became less places of entry than places of exclusion. Places that guarded and secured and purported to maintain the integrity, often explicitly defined as the racial purity of our borders. 1900, the US was an imperial power with territories that stretched from San Juan to Manila. So a person with dark skin was as likely to be a colonial subject as a citizen. So from 1865 to 1900, from emancipation to empire. This is a quick and stunning turn in our sense of America and the purpose of our government. And the story of this turn, most assuredly, goes through the West, where the last decades of the 19th century involved a massive exercise of government power to take land and wealth from one group and to give it to another, and then justifying that redistribution with the logic of white supremacy. Now, the Nez Perce War allows us to consider the broad transformations that the US was making in those years following Reconstruction, but through the eyes of individual Americans. I wanted to show how real people saw and experienced these epical transformations. And in particular, I wanted to focus on the clash between two important, underappreciated figures in late 19th century America. An Army general named Oliver Otis Howard, and a Native American chief named Joseph, who was the leader of a small band of Nez Perce Indians in far northeastern Oregon. So, who was Oliver Otis Howard? He was a Maine Yankee, and he was a West Point graduate. If you look at this slide, you can see that he's sporting some serious facial hair. So actually, one of the challenges of writing my book was very early on, I realized you run out of synonyms for bushy. Rippling, rabbinic didn't quite work. And a turning point in Howard's life occurred in 1857 when God visited him. He was 26 years old. He was desperately lonely and depressed while battling clouds of flies and mosquitoes in the worst, most remote Army posting imaginable, Tampa, Florida. Howard called Tampa a field for self-denial, which I think is a slogan that's ripe for renewal. I can just imagine the signs, welcome to Tampa, field for self-denial. The Civil War broke out right as Howard was trying to decide whether to resign from the Army, go to seminary, and pursue the ministry. But he stayed and he fought from Bull Run onward. In June 1862, in the Peninsula Campaign, he lost his right arm above the elbow. Actually makes reading his letters quite a challenge. But he returned to the front within just a few months, and he ended the war as one of Sherman's commanders in the March to the Sea, and then in the final push through the Carolinas. Fighting for the Union became his way to serve God. Now, as the Civil War was ending, Howard was tapped to lead the Freedmen's Bureau, this new experiment in what the government could or should do for its people. And at root, the agency's task, Howard's mission, was to give concrete meaning to liberty and equality. These are values that were boldly pronounced in the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th and 14th Amendments, but they were never precisely defined. The historian Leon Litwack once described the central question of the post-Civil War moment as how free is free? And the Bureau's role, Howard's role, was undeniably crucial to answering that question. Now, histories of Reconstruction have cast Oliver Otis Howard as a flawed hero. In many ways, he embodied the limitations of the federal government's efforts to remake the rebel South. So the historian William McFeely gave Howard the ominous epithet, the Yankee stepfather. Now, I've lived in Massachusetts, I've off and on for many years. I've gotten to know many Yankee stepfathers who are warm, wonderful individuals. But McFeely didn't mean it as a compliment. At the same time, Howard was a true champion of African American civil rights. During the war, he was constantly meeting men and women who had crossed Union Army lines, searching for freedom. And there were many abolitionists who themselves had pretty racist views, and they parsed and sliced and diced equality into social equality as opposed to political equality. But Howard met these men and women, and he was convinced thoroughly of the unitary nature of equality. And after the war, he integrated his church in Washington. He channeled a tremendous amount of Bureau resources to education, which he thought was a way to help African Americans leverage themselves into liberty and equality in case the government sort of lost its nerve. And when a new university for black men and women was being proposed in Washington, D.C. at the end of 1866, originally the proposal was to create a theological school to train preachers. And Howard, as religious as he was, stood up and said, no, you have to think bigger. It has to be a full university with a college and a normal school to train teachers and a medical school and a law school. It has to really be an exemplar for the whole nation. And when that school finally was chartered by Congress the next year, in 1867, 150 years ago, it was only natural that it would be named for Howard University. Now, Howard thought his role in Reconstruction was God's providence. This is a picture of Howard right around 1877, 1880. And Howard was convinced that Reconstruction would be the cause of his life. It was why he had been put on earth. It was what he had been meant to do. It was the most important thing that had ever happened to him. But then it all fell apart. Reconstruction collapsed. The Freedmen's Bureau's mission was compressed and snuffed out. And by the 1870s, the politics of the nation had fundamentally shifted. Otis Howard found himself a lightning rod for attacks on Reconstruction. He personally was humiliated. He watched the Bureau become a joke in the court of public opinion. And he nearly went broke defending himself from a raft of corruption charges. So what do you do when your life's work, the thing that gave everything leading up to it meaning, is dashed? Howard went searching for redemption, and he thought he could find it not by leaving government and protesting what it was turning into, but by staying and serving. I look at Rex Tillerson standing up there, and I have a little bit of an Oliver Otis Howard flashback. So after being exonerated by one last investigation, Howard was able to rejoin the active duty military. And in the summer of 1874, he was given command of the Army's Department of the Columbia, based in Portland, Oregon. And it seemed to him and his friends that this was a merciful exile, just a clean break from his life in the capital. He saw his time in the West as his great second chance. And in his drive for personal redemption, he may have struggled to make sense of the new American order that was taking shape, but he was determined to succeed in it. And what did Howard do when he was out west? A large part of his job involved forcing Native Americans onto reservations. He wanted to do this in a peaceful, negotiated way. And for him, from his perspective, the reservation policies, Ulysses Grant's peace policy, enacted a kind of fantasy of Reconstruction. Here is his superior officer, Bill Sheridan. And there was a fantasy of Reconstruction in that Reconstruction, he tried to give African Americans small plots of land and wasn't able to in the end. But by golly, he could give 40 acres and a mule, or really 20 acres and a mule, to Native Americans in the West. And he thought this could be done peacefully, and that held true for at least a few years. But in the summer of 1877, Howard led a military campaign against a pretty small group of Nez Perce families who refused to leave their ancestral territories in the Wallowa Valley in Oregon, and then also across Hell's Canyon and the Salmon River Valley into Idaho. About 900 or so at its height, men, women, and children fled through Idaho and Montana and along the Continental Divide, separating Idaho from Montana, down into Wyoming, across the newly created Yellowstone National Park, where they took some of the first tourists there hostage. And then they cut north through the Buffalo Plains, trying to reach Sitting Bull in Canada. For nearly 4 months and close to 1,400 miles of some of the roughest terrain in the country, they outran Howard and his troops. And then finally, 140 years ago today, soldiers trapped the Nez Perce families just about 30, 40 miles from the border near Chinook. They were starving, they were freezing, they were devastated by months of vicious battles, and their surviving leader was Chief Joseph. So the title of my book comes from Chief Joseph. His Nez Perce name, Henmat Tuyalakek, is translated as thunder rolling in the mountains or thunder rising to ever loftier heights. And as much as this book began with Howard, its heart is Chief Joseph. And in our current time, when so many people are debating what we can do to defend cherished constitutional values, whatever they may be, how we can speak to power, I see Joseph and his story as a really important touchstone. So who is Chief Joseph? Now, Howard had met and negotiated with him before the war, and Joseph had emerged as a Nez Perce spokesman in the early 1870s when he was a young man, about 30 years old, outranked by many leaders who had long experience hunting buffalo, fighting rival tribes to the east, Blackfeet, Lakota, Crow. But Joseph made an immediate impression on Howard and on many other officials. So, for one thing, he was tall. He was well over 6 feet. He towered over Oliver Otis Howard, kind of occupies my altitude. And Joseph was strikingly handsome. People who negotiated with him described mesmerizing encounters. He was someone who didn't just shake hands, he would clutch a hand and hold it. He would gaze deep into people's eyes. It was a practice that showed strength and immense confidence, but also a certain irresistible vulnerability. So when Howard first met him in the spring of 1875, he wrote that Joseph had looked into his soul while revealing his own motives in turn. Joseph inspired incredible trust, and then just this flood of romantic projections and descriptions, even from people who profess to doubt the very humanity of Indians. So Joseph would meet Howard several times to argue that his people should be allowed to keep their ancestral land. The leaders of other bands had signed a treaty in 1863 giving up the Wallowa Valley, but Joseph's band wasn't even represented at the council. Joseph forcefully engaged a language of universal liberty and equality in his attempt to preserve his band's place in a changing America. And he uses a language of sovereignty. His people are a sovereign group entitled to respect government to government, but it also blurs into a language of individual rights. That we only ask an even chance to live as other men live, Joseph famously said. Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to think and talk and act for myself, and I will obey every law or submit to the penalty. It's strikingly modern language, right? If you think about what rights we can expect as American citizens, yeah, that's a pretty good list there. And Howard, for his part, would have immediately recognized Joseph's ideas and rhetoric, his vision of what it means to be American. Joseph was engaging many of the same ideas, the same values of liberty and equality that Howard had pioneered as commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. By the time he first met Howard, Joseph was a seasoned advocate. But one thing that surprised me as I began my research was how often Joseph had argued his case in the years leading up to the war. When ranchers started encroaching on Nez Perce lands in the Wallowa Valley, spring of 1872, they told Joseph rightly that the valley had been put into the public domain and that the General Land Office had divided it up into homesteads and were giving them out. And if we think about it, really that should be the end of the story and not a beginning. Right? Just, once the land's given out, it's really hard to put that back into the bottle. So that presented Joseph with a real challenge. He had to figure out how to move the federal government, and how to find and connect with American power, how to change official policy, and all this from an incredibly isolated mountain valley 2,500 miles from Washington. Right? So I expected this crowd, there are more people than in, when I'm in Washington, D.C., who've been to the Wallowa Valley. And driving in today is tough enough. But in the early 1870s, the homesteaders from the Grand Ronde Valley, to get over the mountains, they had their wagons, like we expect homesteaders to have, but we don't expect homesteaders to have to take apart their wagons, physically haul them up the mountain, and then put them back together again. Now, this is how isolated the valley was. And Joseph didn't speak Nez Perce. He didn't speak English. He did his talking in Nez Perce and in Chinook jargon, regional trade language. And he was Native American, and these kinds of Native American land claims, especially after the land has been given away, purportedly by treaty, that these kinds of land claims had never gotten much of a hearing. So what did he do? Joseph decided to plead his case to just about every federal official he could find. He went to the local Indian agent, to a regional supervisor, to a congressman who happened to be home for recess, and he pressed his claim until all these people reported to Washington that they thought maybe Joseph was right. He met with settlers and convinced many of them too. And what's amazing is just about every conversation he had, people would say to him, well, we think you might be right, but what do you expect us to do? We're just one person, we're 2,500 miles from Washington. There's just, nothing we can do. But almost immediately, Joseph's efforts bore fruit. Just a year after he began advocating, it starts in 1872, by 1873, President Ulysses Grant signed an executive order reserving a substantial portion of the Wallowa Valley to what was described as the roving Nez Perce bands. And getting land yanked out of the public domain and given back to a band of Indians who are not assimilating, right, who are living traditional nomadic lives. This was no small achievement. But that order in the end resolved nothing. Oregon's governor and the congressional delegation, they went ballistic. They appealed to the Secretary of the Interior, and almost immediately, the machinery of government kind of shifted into reverse, and that led to a second executive order in 1875, opening the valley up to settlement once again. Now, here's where it gets interesting. You'd think that an order from the president, again, would be the end of the story. But Joseph didn't see that second executive order as resolving his claims with any finality. He kept pressing, and he convinced multiple army officers who were sent to investigate the situation that the Nez Perces were the rightful owners of the valley. He also asked repeatedly to be allowed to go to Washington and work this out with President Grant face to face. Joseph intuitively understood how the American state worked, that it had many faces, many competing authorities. The power in America was split, and it remained split in so many different ways. Among federal, state, local governments, legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and among overlapping agencies that compete with each other all the time. The courts, they followed elaborate procedures, and the legislative process was similarly drawn out and highly choreographed. But America after the Civil War was increasingly governed by administrators in the executive branch. And while the government was getting more adept at implementing policies, the technology of governing was improving, and the federal government could extend its reach coast to coast, policymaking at the executive level remained wide open. Far-flung bureaucrats were vested with a tremendous amount of discretionary authority. And this created a fluid core of government power that almost begged its subjects to contest every decision. There was always someone else to turn to, and often it seemed that persistence in this process could be leveraged into rights. Right? It's like Tom Petty said, won't back down. Right? Joseph saw this. He figured it out. But Howard never understood this, even though he had lived through this kind of governing as head of the Freedmen's Bureau during Reconstruction. He saw Chief Joseph not as someone participating in a new American process, but rather as someone showing disrespect for it, someone who could only be governed by brute force. Howard had a great deal of discretion in how he would work with what were known as the non-treaty Nez Perces, although really they were following an earlier treaty from the 1863 treaty. But Howard refused to take a conciliatory path. In May 1877, he gave Joseph's band and the other allied bands 30 days, just 30 days, to move with their very large herds from Oregon to Idaho at a time when the Snake and Salmon rivers were at flood stage. And that ultimatum all but sparked the violence and the war. Once hostilities began, Howard was single-minded as he pursued the Nez Perces through the mountains. But military victory did not mean redemption for Howard, and almost immediately he recognized this. Part of this had to do with the fact that it took so long for the Army to catch the Nez Perce bands. And finally, October 5th, as Joseph surrendered, it was as if Howard realized that he was no longer the hero of his own story. Ultimately, Howard wound up playing a key role in making a place for Chief Joseph in American culture. This is Chief Joseph just weeks after the surrender. It was Howard who publicized Joseph's words and discussed the chief at length in 3 books. They had kind of an emotional reunion months before Joseph's death in 1904. And largely because of Howard, Joseph's surrender statement, in which he declared, "I will fight no more forever," became one of the most recited speeches in American schools and really went viral. Whenever anyone wanted to resolve a conflict, they would say, "I will fight no more forever." In the end, it was Chief Joseph and not General Howard who became an inspiration to generations of civil rights activists. Howard may have betrayed the old values of abolition and union and Reconstruction when he played his part in conquering the West and building the new regime. But in a way, Joseph recharged some of the old values of liberty and equality with a new power to speak to the changing nation. His rhetoric is so poignant and so moving that it's easy to overlook that Joseph was not simply making a plea for a full bundle of rights as an American, right? What we might call citizenship. More specifically, Joseph was trying to define citizenship in an age of big government. He was claiming the right to participate in the contentious struggles that are baked into our modern way of governing. It's about the right to speak to the state and to be heard. Joseph represents a set of ideas, he represents a message, but he also represents a set of methods that I think we need now more than ever. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions.
As warriors did Chief Joseph have
Yeah, so there were probably at their height only about 200, 250 warriors. And it's interesting you asked how many warriors were with Joseph. So all through the war, as the Nez Perce bands repeatedly fought off the U.S. forces very successfully, all of the battlefield victories were attributed to Joseph, in part because he was sort of front and center before the war. And people knew he was a very smart man. So during the war, he was Odysseus, he was Achilles, he was Hannibal. After the war, he was the Red Napoleon. But actually, Joseph wasn't a war chief. Right? There were other leaders. In a way, the Nez Perce style of governing, very diffuse and egalitarian. And the bands were autonomous. Within bands, there were multiple people who could claim to be leaders. And even beyond that, people were free to follow their own conscience all the time. And Joseph just wasn't a war chief. His brother actually was a distinguished war chief. And Looking Glass for much of the war was the war chief. And then a man who joined the Nez Perce bands in the Bitterroot Valley, Lean Elk, also known as Poker Joe, he took over the direction of the Nez Perce families after the Battle of the Big Hole. Joseph, he spent much more time sort of tending to the herds, which were incredibly important to their flight. And he also spent a lot of time making sure that the women, the children, the men who were too old to fight were in good enough shape to keep going. And in the end, everything was attributed to him again because he was the leader who negotiated the surrender. But that had more to do with the fact that most of the war chiefs were dead, were killed in the final battle. And the other major chief, the major leader, Whitebird, he had refused to deal with the U.S. government, and he led upwards of a couple hundred people through the siege lines and made it to Canada. Yes?
You had mentioned that Howard had a visit with God. And throughout his efforts, he was fighting between the seminary, religious aspect, and fighting. But at any point did he use that religious connection to God to understand Indians as humans or as animals? And as you take a look at the federal government, they treated them as animals only to get rid of. So how did he battle with that? Was anything written on that?
Yes. So Howard himself was someone who deeply believed that not only that Native Americans were humans, but that they were entitled to full American citizenship. But what he meant by that was as long as they assimilated into the white world, right? As long as they established themselves as yeoman farmers, as long as they, at least in his hope, embraced Christ, that they were as free and equal as everyone else. And the way he put it was, when he grew up in Maine, 1830s, 1840s, and he would listen to stories of people who were old enough to remember when Native Americans lived among them. And they talked about the absolute necessity of killing everybody or driving them all out. And Howard, for his part, thought this was incredibly unjust and horrible. And in his view, though, there were just two paths for Native Americans. The one path was genocidal warfare. The other path was total assimilation. And he thought the reservation policy and assimilation were the proper and humane path. Now, after the Nez Perce War, what's interesting is, he tries to fight this war to the fullest. He tries to win this war because he thinks that's his only path to sort of getting back into the good graces of the nation after Reconstruction. But almost immediately, and it kind of coincides with the emergence of Joseph's celebrity, people start questioning American Indian policy. So almost immediately afterwards, people think, wars of conquest, the reservation policies, maybe both are monstrous. And so 1881, a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson wrote a book that described the previous 100 years of Indian policy as a century of dishonor. And so Howard thought he had done the right thing, and then at the very end he looks around and everybody really wants something else. So Howard believed in the humanity of Native Americans, but in a very narrow conception. He had an aide-de-camp who met Joseph at the surrender. Before that, he was sort of too young to have well-shaped politics. He had been 13 when the Civil War ended, and his recollection of what he felt when he heard that Lincoln was killed was just a little burst of joy that they would have school off for the next few days. And so he kind of drifted into Army life and met Joseph at the surrender, and it radicalized him. It just kind of opened up his political consciousness. And over the course of his very long life that followed, died during World War II protesting the internment of Japanese Americans. He developed a totally different and much more modern sense of how Native people should fit into American government. And he saw a vision of American pluralism, right? The acceptability of difference, right? Even as people have rights as citizens. That today seems pretty commonplace. 110 years ago when he explained it, he was a little blunter. He said, being an American citizen means we all have the right to go to hell if we want to. Right? We can live differently. We can follow different moralities, different religions. But Howard wasn't there yet. He was strictly 19th century. His aide, Charles Erskine Scott Wood, really moved his consciousness into the 20th century. In the back.
I can't think of the exact phrase, but the lack of word of Dick Berger, and the sentence is that, how the hell do you discover a country where there are millions of people living? And having worked on the reservation and been there for, I suppose, 20, 25 years, there's really a simplest, people simply do not understand or care to understand from an Indian, a native point of view. I think assimilation is like dumping somebody in caustic soda and come out the other end of it.
Now, when
Same philosophy.
Well, it's the same thing that is to that question, that you can never white out red to be totally involved in humanity. And because there was separation of color, like the blacks in the South, it was hard for the US government to address that.
when in July, at the end of July, I gave a talk on the Nez Perce Reservation, and afterwards, a man came up to me and said, I've been reading your book, and you left a few facts out. And please tell me, what did I leave out? And he said, in 1492, when the illegal immigrants came, they did not have permission from the rightful owners of the land. How come you didn't put that in your book? And these are I think important comments.
You may have mentioned this, but Indians, we didn't become citizens till 1924. So that's something that I think this younger generation needs to be aware of. I guess we were kind of the suffragettes at the beginning of the century. And so while he was trying to fit in comfortably into this society or this new government that was being laid out for him, he wasn't actually accepted. We began a conversation earlier, and it occurred to me, I really didn't quite understand why he ended up in the Colville Reservation. That's where my father's from. And my understanding is he had some descendants with him, and then the rest of them, they took and sent them to Idaho.
Right, to Lapwai. Yep.
So how did that happen? And they still, some are still in there and
Yes.
as part of their roles with Confederated Colville tribes.
Yep.
So, I mean, for Indians to accept one another, that was no problem. The federal government wanted us all delineated. And Joseph somehow managed to go and live among the Confederated Colville, and is his grave still there?
Yes, his grave's there at Nispelung. So October 5th, 1877, Joseph surrenders, and part of the surrender negotiation, basically over 5 or so days of battle at Snake Creek, north of the Bear Paw Mountains. The Nez Perce warriors had fought the cavalry to a stalemate. And as part of the negotiations, Joseph received assurances from Howard and from Nelson Miles, who was the cavalry colonel who had led the column that wound up besieging the Nez Perce families and stampeding their herds, denying them an escape. They assured Joseph that after the winter, they would be repatriated to the Nez Perce Reservation in Idaho. And so there was a surrender. They were marched down to the Tongue River cantonments. And what wound up happening was William Tecumseh Sherman, who was the commanding general of the U.S. Army, who during the war had basically envisioned the leaders of the Nez Perce bands just swinging from gallows. He overruled that promise. And so instead, the survivors of the final battle were taken to Fort Leavenworth, where they were essentially confined for that winter, and then moved, exiled to Indian Territory, to Oklahoma. And that was, Kansas and Oklahoma were a complete catastrophe for the surviving families. What that meant was they were in malarial lowlands, and about half their number died from malaria and dysentery and cholera, depression, people were killing themselves, tuberculosis, people were gasping for air. And Joseph, in a way, he had been pushing his point and trying to advocate for his people before the war, almost immediately started up again. And he appealed to Howard, who had promised the return to Idaho. And Howard wrote a very cold letter back to Joseph saying, basically, your home now is in Indian Territory, and you should cast your bucket where it lays. But Joseph didn't take that for an answer. He, as he had sort of learned, realized that nothing was final. Right? He was told, you are exiled to Indian Territory forever. And there were Modoc Indians who, after the Modoc War in 1873, had been exiled to Indian Territory, and they were exiled forever. And Joseph went to Washington, D.C., and kind of used his celebrity. Went to Washington, D.C. He was the sensation of Washington society in January 1879, and used it to gather allies. Howard was cold, but Nelson Miles became a big ally, and many other people. And forever wound up being 8 years. 1885, they were allowed back to the Northwest. Now, there were only about a couple hundred people who made the journey back. During those 8 years, I think they had basically 100% infant mortality. Joseph had a baby girl who was born the day that first blood was shed along the Salmon River Valley. And she survived the entire war, survived the ambush at the Big Hole, survived everything. And then she died in Indian Territory. Joseph had 2 wives. One fled with his older daughter to Canada, and he never saw her again. But the mother of his baby, after the baby died, left him, stopped living with him in Indian Territory. So it was called the Ikishpa, the hot place. And they returned to the Northwest. About 100 or so had converted to Christianity while in Oklahoma. And they were allowed to go to Lapway. They were allowed to live on the Nez Perce Reservation. And then the rest, including Joseph, were invited by Chief Moses to live with them on the Colville Reservation. And getting settled there initially was really terrible. There was an Indian agent there who wouldn't feed or clothe them during the winter.
Is this located in what state?
In north central Washington, right where the Grand Coulee Dam is. So there were times that just to survive, they had to go to the Army outpost at Fort Spokane and get food and clothing. But eventually they settled in Nispelum. And then they had small herds. They lived an approximation of their traditional life. And many of them actually were seasonal hops pickers in the Yakima Valley. So that was, they could get close to where they had once been, close to Nez Perce country, and see people who lived on the Nez Perce Reservation and lived on Umatilla Reservation, where they had many friends, Nez Perce and Umatilla. But Joseph never lost sight of the fact that the Wallowa Valley was his home. And what's amazing is, you would think a war of conquest would end any claim he might have to the Wallowa Valley, but he actually kept pressing his point. With the Commissioner of Indian Affairs and Interior Department officials, with all kinds of, with Nelson Miles, with all kinds of officials, again, any official he could. And multiple times for the rest of his life, the question actually would get reopened. There would be these memos that circulated or decisions where they would say, you know, we never actually properly extinguished title to the Wallowa Valley. And so, you know, we could think of Joseph as, and many people thought of Joseph as this kind of romantic, tragic figure. But he was someone who never stopped fighting, never stopped believing that this question of the Wallowa Valley could be reopened and resolved in his favor, really up until the day he died. And he had plenty of reason and plenty of encouragement from lots of parts in the government to know that, you know, his protest, his dissent, his moral witness could actually move mountains. Yes.
I don't know what you learned from your visit with Nez Perce people like you talked about earlier. But as I understand it, Joseph was very fluent, eloquent in the English language. And my dad, Charlie McDonald, born in 1891, and my uncle, Charlie McDonald, born in 1897, recalls Joseph coming to the Flathead Reservation, and they both personally met him. And he spent weeks, months, a month or so with them, with the McDonald family. But anyway, I just thought I'd bring that out, that the last trip also, I think, that Joseph made to Washington happened as late as 2000 or 1903. It's just a few facts, just a few anecdotal information.
Right? So actually, he never spoke publicly in English. He spoke through interpreters. And when he visited the Wallowa Valley, a couple of times before he died, when he visited his father's gravesite, when he visited in the homes of settlers he had known in those 5 years before the war. They never talk about him speaking English.
Well, what my dad said was about, he was about 10, 11, 12 years old. What he said was that he was dancing in a powwow at St. Ignatius. And anyway, he said that this tall Indian man, they called him off the dance floor, and that tall Indian man was standing there, and he said he wore a park suit, tall Indian hat, colorful scarf and moccasins. And he said, I understand your name is Johnny McDonald. I said, yeah. And he said, well, McDonald's are my relatives. Can you take me to your camp? And that was in English. But anyway, my Uncle Charlie said the same thing he recalls. They spent part of their time in those days in the summertime. What they would do is they would get their horses and wagons and go down to the Flathead River and camp and bathe, feast, whatever, hunt.
Well, that's really interesting to me, actually. And it was a statement about Joseph visiting the Flathead Reservation and speaking English. Very interesting to me. In my book, I talk about the diaries that this 12-year-old boy kept, who spent a summer living with Chief Joseph at Nispelem. And he learned Nez Perce and Chinook jargon to communicate with Joseph. So that's an interesting, I have no doubt that after a lifetime of really tilting against the federal government, that he could understand pretty well. So, and I would also understand why he wouldn't speak in English in negotiations, but that's very interesting.
Just one more point is that what my dad and uncle told me is that they not only spoke English, they spoke Nez Perce, they spoke Salish, French, and from Duncan and some of the older colored boys, my grandfather's brother, my grandfather, there was some Gaelic, Gaelic from Scotland.
It's so interesting, the diversity of languages. When I was researching, looking at Nez Perce oral histories, there's some of them about the war, some of them predating the war, or about the time predating the war. Often they talked about these encounters with Lakota or Crow or Blackfeet, often in battle. And they would describe these elaborate dialogues. And I would think, how could people communicate with each other so fluently? And even across battlefields, they would, the final battle, there were Indian scouts who were fighting with Nelson Miles. And people would have these conversations while fighting each other in battle. But it was actually all Plains Sign Language, right? And so the signs were also another way that sort of spanned the Bitterroot Mountains and connected the Nez Perce to many other peoples to the east.
Well, Dan, thank you.
Thank you.
I neglected in my opening remarks to thank two groups that co-sponsored the talk tonight, and so I want to make sure and acknowledge them. One is the Nez Perce National Historic Trail, and the other is the Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History. And so I thank both of them for co-sponsoring tonight's talk.